Hey everybody, this video is called The Despair of Life, and today we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Job, looking at the 3rd chapter, where we're looking at Job's trials, and we're going to see further on his despair of life. And there are 3 questions that this chapter we're going to see Job asking, and many of you might have asked one, if not all, of these types of questions yourselves. And the first one is, have you ever wished that you had never been born? Have you ever said something like, I wish I was never born. Why did God create me? The next question, have you ever asked the Lord, why am I still here? And that's one of the questions that I've asked in my life. Ever since my son Aiden passed from the brain aneurysm, I asked that. It's a legit question. Why am I still here? Why isn't he here? The third question is, have you ever asked, why go on living? And that's probably one of the most scariest questions that you could ask. And many times people ponder that prior to thinking about or attempting suicide. But yet we see Job, a major Bible character who has a book of 42 chapters about him and his friends and his life, take place here. And we see that Job asks all 3 of these questions. In Job chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, it says, after this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job spoke and said. So we take a little break before moving on to verse 3 right here. And one thing I wanted to point out here is from here to the rest of this book in the last chapter, it's going to be poetic in literature. And it's a dramatic poem of speeches attempting to understand Job's suffering. So when we go through the book of Job, we can take the time to think, in 2023, we might ask the question, why do we suffer? Why is there suffering all around us? And these questions were asked by Job many, many, many years ago. And from here through chapter 37, we're going to see a cycle of speeches between Job and his well-meaning friends, including Elihu. And from here through chapter 14, it's the first cycle of speeches between Job and his well-meaning friends as Job begins breaking a week-long silence with a lament. And Job, we see he's starting with cursing the day he was born, the day of his birth, which should have been a day of rejoicing, and he welcomed the day that he would finally die. And we see that Job says something along the lines that I wish I had never been born. And we see the nature that Job is going through. He's going through despair in life and deep pain. And Job's thinking was common in the ancient world. And historian Herodotus described an ancient people who mourned new births for the suffering that new life would endure and rejoiced in pain. Rejoiced in death as a final release from this suffering of life. And many times in our culture, in the nun church, that's the way people view things too. To be born is to just live a life of suffering. The best day is the day you die, because then that all goes away and you don't have to deal with it anymore. And we see that the battle, it's in Job's mind and soul. And many trials in the physical will bring us to mental health issues and troubles. And I think of those that receive a very severe diagnosis from the doctors. They might have a terminal illness, and that can bring down mental health. I believe most times when someone is diagnosed with terminal illness, one of the first things that the medical team will do is seek out behavioral health services for that person. It can be a major life change that brings you down a mental health road. In verse 3 through 10 says, may the day perish on which I was born, and the night in which it was said, a male child is conceived. May the day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor the light shine upon it. May darkness and the shadow of death claim it. May the clouds settle on it. May the blackness of the day terrify it. As for that day, may darkness seize it. May it not rejoice among the days of the year. May it not come into the number of the months. Oh, may that night be barren. May no joyful shout come into it. May those who curse it, who curse that day, those who are ready to arouse Leviathan, may the stars of its morning be dark, and may it look for light, but have none, and not see the drawing of the day, because it did not shut up the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide sorrow from my eyes. So verses 3 through 10, it's very depressing tone to what we are reading here. And Job wishes that he had never been conceived. And sometimes when I read Job early on like this, especially this chapter, I think of Bohemian Rhapsody song comes to mind. And to think of how many people had wished that they had never been born at all. And Job, he felt the joys of his life weren't worth all the pain that he has to endure at this time. And he felt that it would have been better to have never lived than to live and to suffer like that. And he felt that it was better to never have wealth than to lose it. Better to never have children than to lose them and have them all be killed. And Job, he never wanted his birthday remembered, and he wished it had been obliterated from the calendar. Job might have, if he knew what Jehovah's Witnesses were back then, he might have wished that he was a Jehovah's Witness, because they don't observe birthdays or any special time periods. And Job doesn't curse God, but we see that he makes his strongest arguments against God, and especially against the wisdom of God and the plan of God. And Job gives full vent of how he's found. And in verse 8, may those who curse it, who curse the day, wasn't Job endorsing the practices of ancient sorcerers that were taking place? I don't believe that Job believed in their power or committed himself with them. But we see that Job is being very expressing. He's showing his expressive failings. He's communicating intensely. And in verse 8, who cursed Leviathan were those who pronounced the most powerful curses, even to an arousing the destructive sea monster. And this is the first mention in the Bible that we see of Leviathan, the strange creature. And it's a mythical sea monster or dragon that terrorized sailors or fishermen. And we see Leviathan in the Bible, again in Psalm 74, verse 12 through 14, as it refers to Leviathan as a sea serpent, that God broke its head long ago, perhaps at creation. Psalm 104, verse 26 also refers to Leviathan as a sea creature. And Isaiah 27, verse 1, speaks of the future defeat of Leviathan, also associating it with a twisted serpent that lives in the sea. And oftentimes, Satan is represented as a serpent or a dragon, as we see in the very beginning of the Bible, back in Genesis 3, and later at the end toward Revelation 12 and 13. And the Leviathan may be another serpent-like manifestation of Satan, who was the original Rahab. In verse 11 through 19, says here, why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came from the womb? Why did the knees receive me? Or why the breast that I should nurse? For now I would have lain still and be quiet. I would have been asleep, then I would have been at rest. With kings and counselors of the earth, who built ruins for themselves, or princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver? Or why was I not hidden like a stillborn child, like infants who never saw light? There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There our prisoners rest together, they do not hear the voice of the oppressor. The small and great are there, and the servant is free from his master. So we see that Job goes on in his emotional state in a very depressive passage in verses 11 through 19. So now we see that Job is saying, that he wished he was dead at birth, that he wishes he was a stillborn. And it seems that Job held to a similar belief of a modern day doctrine called soul sleep in verse 13. And soul sleep is the belief that the dead lie in the grave in some sort of suspended state until they are resurrected in the final day. And we're going to talk about soul sleep at the wrap up of the video. And later, we see that God challenges Job and he corrects him on his assertions of the afterlife, as we're going to see toward the end of the study in Job 38, verse 2, and Job 38, 17. And that he didn't, in fact, know what life after death was like. And he thought, like many today, of all who pass have gone on to a better place. And you probably hear that among non-believers all the time. And that's how they try to view death. They try to view death as, oh, so-and-so must be at a better place now. At least they're not suffering on this earth. In verse 20 through 26, it says, "Why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to a bitter of soul? How long for death, but it does not come, and search for it more than hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly, and are glad that they can find the grave? Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, and with whom God has hedged in? For my sighting comes before I eat, my groanings pour out like water. For the thing I greatly feared has come upon me, and what I dreaded has happened to me. I am not ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, for troubles come." And this is for another time I'm going to say it, this is a very sad passage today. And Job asked the question that we might run into when we are facing depression or very hard times in life, is why go on living? Why should I even stay alive? Alexa, off. Sorry, I had a timer on there. Job didn't hint of wanting to take his own life, but we see that Job still trusted God for his sovereign hand in the matter of death. But he did consider in many ways in which death would be perceived improvement to his present situation because of the pain. And Satan, as you recall from chapter 1, spoke of a hedge of protection and blessing in chapter 1, verse 10. Whereas Job spoke of a hedge as a prison of living death. And Job's sighing and groanings destroyed any appetite that he might have had. In verse 25-26, it's not a particular thing, but a generic classification of struggling. And the worst fear for anyone could have was coming to pass in Job's life. And we see that Job is mentally not well. He is facing, in this writing, we see that Job is facing severe anxiety and faring more. So to wrap up today's video, we look at Job's curse in his birthday, but not his God. So even though Job is going through these hard life experiences and trials and tribulations and sufferings, we see that Job doesn't curse God. We see that Job has faith in God. We see he curses his birthday, though. And we see that Job expresses himself in the flesh, that first off, he wished he had never been born. And we see Job ask the question, though, why didn't he die at birth? Why wasn't he a stillborn where he wouldn't have to be going through this right now? And we see that Job longs for the grave as a release from his present misery. And sometimes when we go through pain, and I hear this, sometimes when people pass kidney stones, one of the most painful things, that they wish that they were dead, rather than going through that painful time period. And we see that Job longs for the grave. We see that Job held to soul sleep like doctrine. And to talk about that a little bit more, Job's lack of knowledge of the afterlife is understandable, as the Old Testament had a very cloudy understanding of immortality. Immortal. however you say it. In 2 Timothy 2, verse 10, I want to go over to 2 Timothy 2:10. Says here, "Therefore I endure all things for the sake of the elect, that they also may obtain the salvation which is in Christ Jesus with eternal glory." So Jesus brought life and immortality to light through the gospel. In 2 Corinthians 5, verse 6 through 8, so we talked a little bit here about soul sleep, the doctrine of soul sleep. But in the Bible, 2 Corinthians, when I get there, 2 Corinthians 5, verse 6 through 8, I believe the Apostle Paul does not believe in soul sleep. And it says here, "So we are always confident, knowing that while we were at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not by sight. We are confident, yes, well pleased, rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord." So the Apostle Paul didn't preach soul sleep. He didn't say that people stay until the resurrection. We see that when people leave the body, when people die, they become present with the Lord if they belong to Him. And the Apostle Paul taught that if he wasn't alive on this earth, that he's in the presence of God and not in a suspended state lying in a grave. In Philippians 1:21, Philippians 1:21 says, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." So Paul taught that if he had died, that it would be immediate gain. And the chapter 3, it ends with Job's lament of why go on living. And we know many of us, if not all of us, have asked that question from time to time. And we'll see in Nexus, we'll be looking at the first speech of his friend Eliphaz next week. So I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. God bless.